may I invite Chris, Dong Shikui, and Jayanta to please come to the... and very quickly, Chris is a PhD student of sociology at the... Chris is a PhD candidate of sociology at the New School for Social Research, and he's also been a ICS student fellow. His paper title is Figuring Out Responsibility, Making Sense of Climate Change in China. And the two discussants we have today is Dong Shikui. Dong is a professor at the School of Environment, Beijing Normal University, and also an ICI fellow. And the second discussant is Professor Jayanta Bandyopadhyay, professor and head of the Center for Development and Environment Policy at the Indian Institute of Management at Calcutta, and he is also an ICI fellow. May I request which one, who would like to go first, Dong or Jayanta? Yes, I know. Which, we don't have to.
I go there?
Yes, please.
Okay. I need to carry
my presentation.
my laptop. Okay, thank you very much, Nimmi. And it's my great pleasure to be discussed for Eric's paper. For me, this is a really fascinating paper coming from the on-the-ground study. It begins with the enhanced public awareness on the environmental problems through a multitude of sources, such as government services and educations, as well as environmental club activities. Citizens are told by domestic and international actors to change their lives, to take action, to save water, and to live in a low-carbon life. In Chinese, we call it 低碳生活. However, they are not often told why. I do agree with this point. With this background, this paper integrates the first-hand survey and interview information with secondary documents from literature to piece together a picture of how Chinese generally view responsibility for solving the environmental problems. This paper explores the existing concepts of social responsibility in Western Europe to get some sense of its theoretical and normative foundation, and importantly, how it can tie into the cases of China. It was found in this paper that environment problems in China is not the most serious one, in contrast to income imbalance between the rich and the poor, developing the economy, medical care, and education. In the survey, the respondents think that the government should play the leading role in addressing environmental problems, primarily through the process of regulating factories. In the follow-up interviews, the author found it demonstrates the effort to actually think through the problems and not to rely on set categories of responsibility for the government or individuals. The interviews also revealed that among individuals there is a certain ambiguity about what it is they should be doing. At the same time, in various responses, there is a clear recognition that individuals have a role to play for environmental problems. Yet, this willingness to take on individual responsibility faces challenges from one's daily life and broad social issues. This is the end of my quite short summary for this paper. Now I would like to give my comments to this paper. As an environmentalist, I was very much impressed by reading this paper to learn the responsibility allocations between individuals and governments for environmental protection in China. For me, it is quite a new stuff, Even I have conducted environmental studies in China for more than 2 decades. Yet, there are 2 suggestions and 2 questions coming to my mind for the author. Suggestion 1, the paper actually discusses broader environmental problems rather than climate change. So, although climate change is one of them, therefore, I suggest you change the title into Figure Out Responsibility, Making Sense of Environmental Protection in Contemporary China, because we are talking about today's China, not the past. And also, suggestion 2, the focal groups or interviews in this study are not only the youngs, but also other groups cited from literatures as well. So in abstract, the last sentence should be changed. The arguments in this paper are based on research that is sought to better understand how Chinese people, not youngs, make sense of the environmental protection in their daily lives, including how they understand the responsibility for trying to mitigate the impacts of environmental problems. I also have 3 questions to your paper. First one, I'll finish soon. What are the objectives of this study? What are the contributions of your study in the theoretics of social science, especially environmental sociology? How can you make implications of your findings in this study for the environment protection practices in China? For instance, to influence policymaking for environmental protection or to promote public education for environmental protection, etc. In methodology part, question 2, in methodology part, how did you or other studies you started to choose the interviews? In other words, what principles you followed to sample the target groups of citizens? Do you think they can be representatives of all kinds of Chinese citizens, from rural to urban areas, from the illiterated to the well-educated communities, from young to older generation, from poor to rich classes? And I have 3rd question, which is very specific. By using the European conception of citizenship to argue the position that Chinese citizens take to serve the nation, did you imply or did you think that in Western Europe that citizens normally do not serve the nation, and China should adopt European concept to our citizens? In this case, if this is the case, do you think that citizens should take less responsibility in environmental protection than the governments? If you do think, how can we deal with climate change problems by paying more attention on our daily life? Thank you.
My friend, Professor Dong, has made an excellent review of what is the content of the paper. I will only add a few more or less I agree with Dong. And I would say that the paper is on a highly potential topic, and accordingly, the paper deserves a great deal of attention, and I think it is still a work in progress, and there is a tremendous potential for this topic. But unlike Dong, I do note that the title and the content has a divergence. The title is focused on climate change, whereas the content more or less addresses pollution-related environmental issues. I would not suggest that the paper be transferred as a pollution study, a study of citizens' responsibility in pollution abatement, but unlike what Professor Dong has suggested, I think the paper should be resurrected as a climate change-oriented citizens' responsibility towards climate change-related activity, so that its distinct sort of place, because climate change is not pollution. Pollution has a separate place, and climate change is a distinctly different issue. And in particular, as opposed to the general position taken by both China and India in international spheres, this survey brings out that the industrialized countries are not seen by the citizens as a major problem in the creation of the climate change. Many of the people think that it is their own internal consumption pattern, and citizens' responsibility has got the highest. Then comes the responsibility of the government, then the factories, and then we have the industrialized countries. So there are very interesting distinction from what is global and what is at the national or subnational level. Now, I would say that the paper would be immensely enriched by a mention of what exactly climate change is perceived or meant. There is no description of climate change as perceived by the citizens, but the citizens should be asked to what is your perception of climate change. Someone would say it is warming, someone would say there is more rain or there is less rain. But in the paper, climate change has been taken as a package, but I think it needs to be further broken down into citizens' participation, perception of climate change. It is also interesting to note that the citizens' perception of responsibility is again the highest amount of responsibility is given to the national government, and the national government is seen as the instrument which, under a command and control, pollution control situation, can also go in controlling the industrial production units to be more environmentally responsible. And this directly relates to the confusion that pollution and the greenhouse gas emission needs to be separated. Otherwise, what is a global problem is often seen as a national or local problem, and this distinction is not going to be good for the paper. So I suggested that it can focus on climate change rather than pollution in general. And then after establishing the perceptions of climate change and what citizens perceive as climate change, data from the various Chinese observatories need to be given, whether the citizens' perception agree with the data or not. And that amount of data, it's a paper where we still do not have much of the climate data, but that basic data information would be useful to see what exactly the people are thinking as climate change and whether it is supported by observation in the more scientific spheres. I think these sort of studies need to be made more rigorous, and the sample size for a country like China is rather small, and there has to be a much larger and much more systematic sample collection. It has been a good start, but as far as statistical presentation of the data is concerned, there is a tremendous amount of potential for improving it further. But on the whole, the paper it takes a very new direction. It provides tremendous opening into how citizens perceive environmental issues, in which climate change is one, but other pollution issues are also there. But the two have got little mixed up, so that the local factories and local transportation units are also seen as a major creator of climate change, whereas climate change is much more globally produced and led. I think that how much more time 1 minute more. And in future surveys, the regional distribution has also to be provided, because you are working on a vast country like China, which is the largest producer of greenhouse gases in the world today. And you cannot generalize whole of the country. I think there is a need for further breaking the data into provincial level, so that we have industrial growth in China in certain places, and the perceptions may be different from other places where industrial growth is not very strong. And that will be a very interesting further additional base data that will enrich this paper. But I congratulate the initiative, and I think this paper can become a trend-setting output if some amount of additional input goes in. Thank you.
Thank you for all the comments. They're quite helpful. So I'd just like to try and briefly go through some of these things. A little bit in reverse order. Some of the points that were brought up about how climate change is perceived and the differences in different parts of China, that's something, this is a chapter out of my dissertation. And so some of those things didn't get pulled out of the other chapters in my dissertation to be put into this paper. So other chapters do touch on that a little bit more specifically, looking at how particularly from Beijing down to Shanghai is where by far the most CO2 emissions are. If you go over to the west, Sichuan and so on, there's much less. So you can see that there are definitely differences. And also in terms of how the issue is understood. That's something that in other parts of the dissertation more so. That's one question is that you just ask people, when you hear climate change, what do you think of? Is it just a word on paper or something you just hear, or how do you understand the issue? And actually, I guess then that goes to another point about making the distinction between pollution and climate change. And when I was doing the follow-up interviews, that was something that the interviewees could not make a distinction between. Because when I went over to China, I said, I'm interested in climate change, and I was getting ready to do my research. And more than once, people would get quite angry at me, and they'd say, water pollution, water pollution, water pollution. That's the most important issue. Why are you talking about climate change? And so when I did my survey, I had questions about water pollution, air pollution, and climate change. A little bit hoping to maybe kind of soften the edges so people wouldn't get so upset about climate change. And so when I would do the follow-up interviews, and I'd ask about these 3 questions, and I'd ask about how do you divide responsibility for these 3 issues. And when it would come to climate change and air pollution, quite often people are like, what's the difference? And so I think a little bit, that's one thing, in terms of, looking at my papers that, sometimes when you talk about climate change and CO2 emissions, is it a matter of air pollution or is it a matter of climate change? So that's something that still need to work through a little bit. But also, like I said, it's something that those I was talking to, they also don't always make the distinction. In terms of, I would say maybe points, the first question, the third question of Professor Dong. Yesterday, we were talking about, the increase in studies about China and India. And who are these studies for? Are these studies for India? Are these studies for China? Are these studies for Americans and Europeans? And so to a large extent, I'm then using the language of American and European scholars in drawing on different theories of citizenship that come out of Europe and North America. And so using these different theories of citizenship. But the thing is that on one hand, I guess it makes it easier for the audience perhaps to understand what I'm talking about. But at the same time, the research revealed is that there's a lot of collaboration on this issue. And that regularly, whether it's Beijing, Shanghai, is that you have all these different nodes within networks of activists, of Europeans and Chinese, Americans and Chinese that are working together on these issues. And so when it came to the question specifically of citizenship, I was more so, that's just the point about serving the state. That was just one scholar who's at UCLA, Chinese scholar, sociologist, anthropologist. So it's not perhaps my personal opinion, but it sort of was a contrast to T.H. Marshall and his conception of citizenship coming out of Europe. So for me, I'm trying to, in part, by drawing on some of these theories, contribute to the fact that there's already quite a bit of international collaboration on these issues. And so it further, I guess, develops the discussion, further develops the understanding of what's going on. In terms of the population, my survey was quite limited. In part, I used the online survey because I have a horrible time reading handwritten Chinese. And so I can only read typed Chinese. And so I used the online survey, and that has limitations. I emailed about 50 contacts I had. They all were able to get about 5 people to fill out the survey. I was focused primarily on youth initially for my own personal research. And so I know that for my own follow-up interviews, it was college students in Beijing, largely, with some professionals, that roughly in the age range of 18 to 35. Now, I also knew that there were some limitations to my survey, and that's why I was trying to find every single survey I could that's been done on this. In part because, coming back to the notion of Western scholarship, is it just outsiders who are asking about responsibility, or are there actual Chinese research as well asking about this question of responsibility? And so that's where I found that there were different surveys, like the Chinese College Climate Change Network. They've done their own survey, scholars out of Hong Kong. And then you have some partnerships between, say, the Japanese, Norwegian, Chinese governments all working together as well on this. And some of these surveys surveyed people from all the provinces. And so they tried to be much more representative than the work that I did. But also because there's nothing that's been done like this before, at least in terms of English language, asking about climate change and asking about responsibility, it was sort of new territory. And so quite often, unfortunately, I do kind of veer more generally into environmental issues, and not so much specifically climate change. And like you've pointed out, in the future, there's opportunities to more specifically explore climate change more.
Thanks, Chris. I think we have just about 4 to 5 minutes for a quick round of queries or comments. Again, we may not be able to give Chris a chance to respond, but maybe over lunch we can have informal discussions. So if there are any one-line, single-line queries or questions, please.
Yeah, I guess I was just wondering, on an issue like climate change, just even thinking analogically to a country like the United States, understanding perceptions of responsibility themselves are shaped by state action and the type of information that's available. So I wonder to what extent, in the case of China, I mean, looking at the survey data, depending on how you structured it, could you see a type of dialectic or co-production of notions of responsibility and how that shapes notions of citizenship based on, or even to the extent that it's shaped by citizens sort of operating independently, responding to climate change or responding to impacts from climate change versus all the information, all the sort of narratives of development and state projects that the state is sort of responsible for producing.
Quickly, thank you. I think that's a very interesting presentation. Things like climate change or development, you really have to go by categories of people. If you go to a country like India, and if you ask what is development, for a farmer, development is absolutely different than what to a politician is all about. So we did this survey in Sikkim about 2 years back about the impact of climate change and what perceptions at different levels. And one of the things which we detected was there are people who are fully aware of climate change and its implications. But there are, at the same time, people who are not aware anything about, who do not know, who haven't heard the term climate change at all, yet they have adjusted with the situations. We went to the farmers in the north, the tribal farmers, and found that they were growing radish, say, up to September, and they conserved radish for the entire winter, and they started growing again in June. And they did it for hundreds of years. Today they have started growing, they can grow radish in the winter also. And we asked them, how can you grow radish in winter also? He says, we do not know, but now we can grow radish during winter, right? Now they didn't know about it. So if you do not categorize the people, say if you go to the forest officials and if you ask them what is climate change, then they will tell us, yes, this is climate change we feel, because there are now frequent number of occurrences of forest fires and all such kind of things, right? But if you really do not categorize people, then you may not get exactly what you have in mind, on the perception. Then you get only general perceptions. Thank you.
Just to follow up Professor Lama's comment. Actually, I don't know why you said that when you ask the question about the climate change and the normal people, they will become angry. I'm curious about your methodology, because when you ask this kind of question, you should use the simply language to ask people. Like what we do in North India, we normally go to the farmers and ask them, compared to 5 years ago, do you think is there a kind of warming, like 1 centigrade or 2 centigrade warming, or how about the rainfall compared to 5 years ago, and how about your crop growth season, just like Professor Lama said. So I think the language is really important. So I'm curious about your comments about angry of Chinese.
Just a simple question about the research. Are you also asking people whether they trust the information they get? So it's, of course, your own experiences is one thing. The second thing is, of course, that you cannot check milk, for example. How will you check it? So do people actually trust the information that they get, and do they have ideas about other sources of information?
I think we really need to wrap up now. A very quickly, I'd like to thank our discussants, our authors, and the audience, and apologies for the technical hiccups that set us back by half an hour. And a big thanks to Sophia for keeping time, and thanks to Sophia and Manka and the rest of their colleagues who helped set this up, and really thanks to the Indian team for sorry to keep you up so late, and just a couple of quick announcements which the organizers have asked me to convey. All the 8 ICI working, all the 8 papers by the emerging scholars are now uploaded as ICI working papers, and so you can download them and access them. And secondly, in all invited guests, please, you're welcome to join Grace. She will take us to the lunch venue. Thank you. Thanks, Manka.